I had been looking forward to this camping trip for weeks. It was a break I desperately needed, a chance to disconnect from everything and just be alone in nature. I had picked a quiet spot in the woods, far away from the usual crowded campsites. I figured it would be the perfect place for some peace and solitude. Little did I know, my decision to camp out in the wilderness would soon turn into something I wasn't prepared for. I set up camp by a small creek. The area seemed perfect, the sound of running water was calming, and the trees provided a natural shelter from the sun. As I unpacked my gear and set up the tent, I felt an eerie sense of calm. The kind of calm you get when you're in a place so remote, you almost start to feel like the world outside doesn't exist. I liked that feeling. The quiet of the woods was soothing, and I felt free from the usual chaos of life. As the afternoon passed, I started a small fire to cook my dinner. The crackling of the fire was the only sound, aside from the rustling of the leaves in the breeze. The sun began to set, casting long shadows across the campsite. I wasn't worried. After all, I had camped before and I knew how to stay safe. But as the last light of the day disappeared, I felt a strange unease creeping in. The forest around me seemed to grow darker, more oppressive. The wind picked up slightly, making the trees sway, and I found myself looking around more than usual. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I told myself it was just my imagination, that I was alone, but there was something off. I tried to ignore it and focused on the fire, watching the flames dance and flicker. Night came quickly, and I settled into my tent, the warmth from the fire still drifting towards me. I was just about to close my eyes when I heard something, a soft, distant sound. It wasn't the usual rustle of wildlife moving around. This was something different, almost deliberate. I froze, my heart thumping in my chest. The sound stopped, and I told myself it was just an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer. It was too dark to see, but whatever it wasn't coming any closer. I tried to shake off the discomfort and lay back down, but sleep wouldn't come. I could still hear the occasional rustle, but it wasn't as frequent now. It was the kind of silence that makes you more aware of the small noises around you. And then there was a new sound, a thud. A heavy thud, like something large had just stepped on a branch, breaking it. I sat up quickly, my mind racing. This wasn't an animal. Something was out there. The sound came again, closer this time. I grabbed my flashlight from beside my sleeping bag, my hands trembling. I was alone. I reminded myself of that. I was alone, and nothing could hurt me. But as I unzipped the tent, my flashlight flickered and then went out completely. Panic hit me like a wave. My heart was pounding so loudly I was sure it could be heard from miles away. I scrambled to get the flashlight working again, fumbling in the darkness, but all I could hear was my own breath, ragged and fast. Finally, I managed to get it back on, the beam weak but steady. I pointed it toward the source of the noise, but there was nothing. I stood there for a moment, staring into the shadows. I wanted to believe it was just my nerves getting the best of me, but something wasn't right. The stillness of the night was unnerving. I tried to convince myself it was just an animal, but the nagging feeling that something was off wouldn't go away. I stayed inside the tent for the rest of the night, clutching the flashlight, listening to every sound, every movement. Eventually, I fell into a restless sleep, waking up several times to the same unsettling feeling. By morning, I was exhausted and on edge, but I convinced myself it was just the stress of being alone in the woods. I decided to pack up early and leave. I had been planning to stay another night, but the unease I felt was too much. As I gathered my things, I noticed something strange. The area around my campsite seemed disturbed. The ground had been scratched up, like something heavy had dragged its way through the trees. I stared at the marks for a while, trying to make sense of it. I didn't know what could have made them, but I didn't want to find out. I was just about to finish packing when I heard it again. a thud, followed by another. But this time it was closer, much closer. My breath caught in my throat as I grabbed my bag and started walking quickly, trying not to break into a full run. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. Every step I took seemed to echo, and I couldn't help but glance over my shoulder, half expecting to see something or someone lurking in the trees. The sound of footsteps behind me grew louder, and panic surged. I was no longer walking, but running, my heart pounding in my chest. The trail back to the car seemed to stretch on forever, the trees growing thicker and more oppressive. I didn't dare look back anymore. All I could do was run, my legs burning with effort. It was the longest, most terrifying trek I had ever made. Eventually, I made it back to the road, where my car was parked. I threw my bag into the trunk, barely able to control my shaking hands as I fumbled for the keys. I could still hear something, footsteps, slower now, coming from the woods behind me. The air was thick with tension, and for a moment, I thought I saw something move in the trees. But I didn't wait to find out. I started the car and sped away, not looking back, not until I was miles down the road. The rest of the drive was a blur. My mind raced with questions. What had happened back there? Had I been imagining things? I didn't know, and part of me didn't want to know. I just wanted to get home, to feel safe again. I never went back to that campsite. To this day, I can't shake the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just out of sight. But I know one thing for sure. Sometimes the wilderness isn't as peaceful as it seems. And sometimes it's better to leave the unknown exactly where it belongs, in the dark corners of the forest, where it's safest. I've been an outdoor enthusiast for as long as I can remember. Hiking, camping, fishing. There's something about nature that has always calmed me down, made me feel at peace. I used to take weekend trips with friends or solo treks into the wilderness when I needed time to clear my head. But that one weekend changed everything. It started like any other trip. I packed my backpack with all the usual gear: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, flashlights, and a first aid kit. Nothing fancy, just the essentials for a couple of days in the woods. I had chosen a remote location this time, somewhere far off the beaten path. There were no marked trails or campsites, the kind of place where the air feels thick and the trees seem to close in around you, almost like they're watching. The weather forecast had predicted clear skies and mild temperatures, so I didn't expect any surprises. I left early on a Friday morning, feeling the excitement build as I made my way out of town and into the forest. The drive was uneventful, just the usual winding mountain roads, the occasional deer darting across, and the silence that only a long stretch of forest can provide. When I reached the trailhead, the sun was still high, and the parking lot was empty. It felt like I was the only one there, which suited me just fine. The trail wasn't marked, but it wasn't hard to follow either. Just a few worn paths that looked like they had been walked on by the occasional hiker or animal. As I set off into the woods, I felt a sense of freedom wash over me. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves beneath my boots, the distant calls of birds, and the rustling of branches in the wind. The temperature was perfect, not too hot and not too cold, and I felt like I could walk forever. Around midday, I found a small clearing by a creek. The water was crystal clear, and the rocks were smoothed by years of running water. I set up camp there, knowing I wouldn't find anything better. I pitched my tent, gathered firewood, and cooked a simple meal, just some dried pasta and canned vegetables. The fire crackled and popped as the sun began to dip behind the trees, casting long shadows over the clearing. As night fell, the air grew cooler, and I wrapped myself in my sleeping bag, watching the fire dance. There was something soothing about the flickering light in the dark, the way it pushed back the blackness and made the forest feel less imposing. I had planned to just relax and enjoy the solitude, but something about the night felt different. It was too quiet, if that makes sense. Not the usual hum of insects or the rustling of animals in the underbrush. Just silence. I tried to push the feeling aside. Maybe I was just tired, or maybe it was the isolation. I thought about reading a book or listening to music, but I didn't want to risk attracting unwanted attention by using my phone. It was supposed to be a time to disconnect, after all. The night wore on, and the silence only deepened. At some point, I must have drifted off, because I woke up suddenly, my heart racing. The fire had burned low, leaving only a few glowing embers. The wind had died down completely, and the only sound was the soft gurgle of the creek. That's when I heard it. At first, it was barely noticeable, just a faint sound in the distance. A rustling. Maybe it was an animal, maybe a person, but I couldn't be sure. My instinct was to stay still, not make a sound, and wait to see if it would pass. But the rustling grew louder, closer. It wasn't an animal. It sounded like footsteps. Someone was walking through the woods, deliberately. Not the hurried steps of an animal, but the steady pace of a person. I tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe it was just another hiker, lost in the night, making their way through the woods. But the more I listened, the more I realized something wasn't right. The sound was too deliberate, too calculated. Whoever it was wasn't just passing through. They were coming closer. I couldn't see anything beyond the edge of the clearing, the darkness too thick for even the faint light of the embers to cut through. I felt my heart beat faster in my chest. Every muscle in my body tensed, and for the first time I wished I had brought a weapon. But it was too late to regret that now. All I had was my flashlight, which I quickly grabbed from my pack. I turned it on, shining it towards the edge of the clearing. The beam cut through the dark, but I couldn't see anyone. Still, the footsteps continued, now closer than ever. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I had to make a decision. Should I confront whoever was out there? Or should I pack up and leave before things got any worse? I couldn't do either. If I packed up, they'd know I was leaving, and I'd be exposed. If I confronted them, it could escalate into something I couldn't handle. I sat there, frozen in my tent, listening. The footsteps were unmistakable now. Someone or something was definitely out there. They weren't just walking aimlessly. They were circling, moving around the clearing, trying to find a way in. The silence that followed felt like an eternity. I couldn't breathe, couldn't move. My mind raced, trying to come up with a plan, but everything seemed useless. I felt trapped, alone, and vulnerable. I reached for my knife just in case, though I didn't know how much use it would be in the dark, with someone who clearly knew the woods better than I did. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the sound stopped. The footsteps ceased. The woods went silent again. I waited for what felt like an hour, though it was probably only a few minutes. My heart was still pounding, and my hands were shaking, but I knew I couldn't stay like this forever. Slowly, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The flashlight beam cut through the trees, illuminating the clearing. But there was no one there. I stepped out cautiously, scanning the shadows. My senses were on high alert. Every crack of a twig, every rustle of leaves felt like a threat. But I saw nothing, heard nothing. For a moment, I allowed myself to believe that maybe I had imagined the whole thing. But the unease in my gut told me otherwise. I wasn't going to risk staying there any longer. I quickly packed up my gear, taking down the tent and stuffing everything into my bag as quickly as I could. It was still dark, and the woods felt even more oppressive now. The feeling of being watched didn't go away. I decided to head back to the car, even though I knew it would take me a few hours to get there. I couldn't stay there another minute. My legs felt heavy, my mind racing as I navigated through the dark forest, trying to remember the path back to the trailhead. I walked for what felt like forever, constantly looking over my shoulder, half expecting someone to jump out at me. But I made it back to the trailhead without incident, my car still sitting there, empty and quiet. I drove back to civilization, the headlights cutting through the darkness, the tension in my shoulders slowly easing as the trees gave way to the distant glow of the town. It wasn't until I got home that I realized just how shaken I had been. The next morning, I checked the news. There had been reports of a missing hiker in that area, someone who had gone off the trail and hadn't been seen since. They didn't find the body, but the search had been called off after a few days. They assumed the person had just gotten lost and had wandered too far off the trail. I never went back to that spot. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone out there. Whoever or whatever had been following me, I couldn't explain it. But I knew one thing for sure. Nature wasn't as peaceful as I once thought. The woods have secrets, and sometimes those secrets are better left undiscovered. It was supposed to be a weekend getaway, a chance to escape from the constant buzz of life. Just me, my tent, and the wild. I had planned it all out perfectly, a remote campsite in the woods, far from the usual crowds. The kind of place where you could hear nothing but the wind rustling the leaves and the occasional bird calling out. A place where you could actually feel alone. When I arrived, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows on the ground. The air had that earthy smell, mixed with pine and damp leaves from a light rain earlier in the day. The kind of smell that makes you think of long walks and peace, or at least that's what I thought at the time. I set up camp near the edge of a small clearing, surrounded by tall trees that seemed to stand guard, their thick trunks and dense foliage blocking out most of the light. It was the perfect spot, isolated, peaceful, and quiet, the kind of place where you could almost hear your own thoughts. I was almost done with setting up my tent when I heard a snap, the kind of snap that comes from a branch being stepped on. I froze, listening intently, but all I heard after that was the usual sounds of nature. Birds, the wind, the rustling of leaves. I shrugged it off, assuming it was some animal, maybe a deer or something. Animals, after all, were a part of the deal when camping in the woods. As night began to fall, I lit a small fire, the flames flickering and crackling, casting dancing shadows on the ground around me. The warmth felt good against the cool evening air, and I relaxed, leaning back against a log, watching the fire. It was peaceful, too peaceful, but it felt right. The silence of the forest was a strange thing. I've always found it comforting at first, but the longer you sit with it, the more you start to notice the little things. The way the trees seem to sway just a little too rhythmically. The faintest whisper of movement just outside the firelight. The distant feeling of being watched. That's when I heard it again. A rustling in the bushes. Not an animal this time, but something deliberate. Slow, cautious. I sat up straight, heart racing. I looked around, but all I could see were the dark silhouettes of the trees around me. The fire crackled louder, and the shadows seemed to stretch longer. I was sure I wasn't imagining it. Something was out there. I grabbed the flashlight from my backpack, my hand trembling just a bit as I turned it on and scanned the area around my campsite. The beam of light swept across the clearing, then into the trees. Nothing. I tried to convince myself it was just a deer or some other animal, but deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I decided to call it a night. There was no reason to get paranoid. It was probably just a branch or an animal moving through the underbrush. I got into my tent, zipped it up tightly, and tried to settle down. But sleep didn't come easy. The forest around me felt alive in a way I wasn't used to. It wasn't just the usual night sounds. It was something else, an almost oppressive stillness, as if the woods were holding their breath, waiting. I pulled the sleeping bag over my head, trying to shut it out, but the sounds outside the tent only seemed to grow louder. Twigs snapping, leaves rustling. Something or someone was out there. The feeling of being watched came back, stronger this time. My heart started pounding in my chest. I told myself it was just my imagination, but that didn't stop the panic from rising. I could feel the presence out there, just beyond the fabric of the tent. Something watching me, waiting. I lay still, listening. The rustling continued, but now it was closer, too close for comfort. I wanted to call out, but I was frozen, my breath shallow, not daring to move. The tent felt so small and vulnerable. The silence around me stretched, punctuated only by the occasional rustle of leaves. Then, in the distance, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A scream. It wasn't human, not quite. It was a high-pitched, guttural sound that seemed to come from deep in the woods. I don't know how long I lay there, not moving, but the scream didn't come again. I waited, straining my ears for any sign of movement, but the only sound was my own breath, quick and panicked. I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my flashlight again and unzipped the tent, stepping out into the cold night air. The fire had almost gone out, leaving only glowing embers, casting long shadows across the clearing. I scanned the area around me, but there was nothing, no movement, no signs of anything out of place. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I decided to pack up and leave. I wasn't about to stick around in the middle of the night, alone in the woods with whatever that thing was out there. I didn't care how much I had planned this trip. The woods weren't worth it. But as I was gathering my gear, I heard the rustling again. It was so close this time that it sounded like it was right behind me. I spun around, flashlight in hand, and caught a glimpse of something moving in the darkness. It was fast, too fast for a deer. It moved like something with intent. My heart skipped a beat, and I bolted toward the trail, not looking back. The whole forest seemed to close in around me as I ran, the sound of twigs snapping underfoot mixing with the pounding of my own heart. I didn't stop until I was on the trail, far from the clearing. The rustling had stopped, but the air felt heavy, like it was pressing down on me, suffocating me. I didn't know what it was or who or what was out there, but I wasn't waiting to find out. The hike back to my car felt endless. Every snap of a branch, every rustle in the bushes, sent a jolt of fear through me. I wasn't sure if it was just my imagination running wild or if there really was something following me, but I didn't want to find out. When I finally saw the lights of my car, relief washed over me like a wave. I didn't hesitate. I threw my gear into the trunk, jumped into the car, and drove off without looking back. I didn't stop until I was miles away, driving through familiar towns and roads, the lights of civilization offering me a sense of safety. I didn't tell anyone about what happened, not because I didn't want to, but because I didn't have the words. How do you explain that kind of fear? That feeling of being hunted, like something was waiting for you in the dark? I've been camping since, but I'll never forget that night. The woods hold a certain kind of magic, I guess, but it's not always the good kind. Sometimes, it's the kind that watches you from the shadows, waiting for the right moment to make itself known. But here's the thing, nothing ever happened to me. There was no monster, no supernatural being, no paranormal event. It was just the forest, and maybe the fact that it's always alive, even when we don't realize it. It's always watching, always waiting. And in the end, I think that's what scared me the most. I still go camping, but I always make sure to stay near the edges of the woods, near the roads where the light's always close by. You never know what might be hiding just out of sight, just beyond the trees. I had always been drawn to the outdoors, the quiet peace of nature, the thrill of being far from everything. So, when my friends and I planned a camping trip deep into the woods, I was excited. We picked a spot away from the usual campgrounds, far enough that we wouldn't hear the noise from nearby tourists. I had no idea then that I'd be running for my life before the trip was over. The first day was perfect. The sun was high, the air was crisp, and we set up our tents near a small, quiet stream. Everything was calm and normal. We spent the day hiking, laughing, and just enjoying the solitude of the forest. It was a typical camping trip. No one had any concerns, and the night sky lit up with stars once we gathered around the campfire. We cooked dinner, shared stories, and just felt the warmth of the fire against the chill in the air. But things started to feel different as night fell. I couldn't put my finger on it, but there was something unsettling about the forest around us. It was the silence, the kind of silence that presses against you and makes you feel like you're being watched. First, I brushed it off as nerves. It was just the woods. It was just the darkness. But that night, when I lay in my tent, I kept hearing noises. Faint at first, just the sound of twigs snapping in the distance. It was probably an animal, I thought. Maybe a deer, maybe a fox. But the noises didn't stop. They grew louder, closer. I lay still, holding my breath, trying to ignore the sound. But then came a loud rustling, like someone, was moving through the underbrush just outside the camp. I could feel my heart thudding in my chest. I got up and zipped open the tent slowly, careful not to make a sound. My flashlight cut through the darkness in front of me. The camp was quiet now, the fire long burned down to embers. But the forest felt alive in a way that wasn't natural. I couldn't see anything at first, just shadows shifting in the trees. I waited for a few minutes, hoping whatever it was would go away. But it didn't. There was something out there. I could feel it. I decided to wake up the others, but just as I was about to move toward the other tents, a sharp, loud crack echoed through the trees, followed by a deep, unsettling growl. My stomach dropped. The growl was too low to be any kind of animal I knew. Definitely not a bear, not a wolf. It was something much deeper, much more menacing. I froze. The others didn't stir, but I wasn't going to wait to find out what was out there. I quickly zipped my tent back up and lay flat, my heart racing. The noises came again, this time closer. The rustling in the underbrush, the snapping of branches. I tried to ignore it, hoping it was just a figment of my imagination. But then, through the silence, I heard it. Faint voice. It was distant, and I couldn't make out the words, but there was no mistaking it. Someone or something was out there. I lay awake for hours, listening to the sounds of the forest, wondering if I was just overreacting. But by the time morning came, the sun rising weakly over the trees, I knew something wasn't right. The others were still sleeping, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. We packed up our things, eager to move to a different location. But as we were getting ready to leave, we noticed something strange. There were tracks in the mud near our tents, human-like tracks, but they were large, almost as if whoever left them had been walking barefoot through the forest. I tried to ignore the creeping feeling in my gut, but I couldn't. I urged everyone to hurry. It didn't take long before we were packed up and back on the trail, walking quickly but quietly, trying to make our way out of the area. But the feeling didn't go away. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig made me jump. Something wasn't right, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't alone. As we walked deeper into the forest, we realized that the trail we were following seemed unfamiliar. The trees looked different. The path wasn't as clear as it had been the day before. It felt like the forest was closing in on us. We were lost. Panic began to set in. We checked our maps, retraced our steps, but nothing seemed right. The forest felt too dense now, the air thick with a sense of foreboding. It was getting late again, and we had no choice but to set up camp. We found a small clearing and decided to make the best of it. But as night fell, the feeling of being watched returned, stronger this time. We all tried to brush it off, but none of us could shake the unease. Then came the sounds, the rustling, the snapping of branches. But this time it was too close, too loud to ignore. I grabbed my flashlight again, scanning the area, but I couldn't see anything in the darkness. Suddenly, a scream shattered the air. One of my friends bolted upright from his tent, eyes wide with fear. We heard the unmistakable sound of heavy footsteps rushing through the brush. There was no time to think. We grabbed our stuff and ran. I've never run so fast in my life. Through the trees, over rocks, scrambling through the underbrush like we were being hunted. We didn't stop until we reached the edge of the forest, breathless and terrified. We didn't stop to ask questions, just made our way back to the nearest road. We flagged down a passing car and got back to civilization. None of us spoke much on the way out, too shaken by what we'd felt, what we'd heard. Looking back now, I know what we experienced was real. Something was out there in those woods, something that didn't want us there. The woods were always a second home to me. I grew up camping, fishing, and hiking with my dad, who had an almost spiritual connection to nature. So, when I decided to spend a solo weekend in the mountains, I wasn't nervous. In fact, I was excited. I wanted to unplug, clear my head, and reconnect with the wild. It was supposed to be peaceful, just me, the trees, and the stars. I chose a remote area about 3 hours from the nearest town. The trailhead was at the end of a dirt road that twisted and turned through dense pine forests. I parked my truck in a small clearing, packed up my gear, and started the hike. The air was crisp, the sky was cloudless, and the sound of birdsong filled the silence. It was perfect. The hike took me deeper into the forest, where the trees grew thicker and the sunlight barely touched the ground. I walked for about 6 miles until I found a flat spot near a small, bubbling creek. It was an ideal campsite, close to water, shaded by towering pines, and far enough from the trail to feel truly alone. I set up my tent, rolled out my sleeping bag, and gathered wood for a fire. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the temperature dropped quickly. I lit the fire and cooked a simple meal, just some beans and rice from a pouch. The warmth of the flames and the soft crackle of burning would make the forest feel less intimidating. Still, the silence out here was different. It wasn't the absence of noise, but the presence of something else, something vast and unyielding. After dinner, I sat by the fire, staring at the glowing embers and thinking about how disconnected life in the city felt. Out here, time stretched. Hours felt like days. There was no rush, no deadlines, no notifications. It was freeing but also unsettling. Around 10 p.m., I decided to call it a night. I put out the fire, secured my food in a bear-proof bag, and hoisted it into a tree a safe distance from my tent. Inside the tent, I zipped myself into the sleeping bag and lay on my back, listening to the faint hum of the creek. Sleep came slowly. I woke up to the sound of something snapping outside. My eyes opened instantly, my body tense. It was pitch black. For a moment, I thought I had imagined it. But then, I heard it again, a distinct crack of a branch breaking underfoot. My mind raced through possibilities. A deer? Maybe a raccoon? But the steps were too deliberate, too heavy. I held my breath, straining to hear. There was a long pause and then another sound, closer this time. I cursed myself for not bringing a gun. I had a hunting knife and bear spray, but they suddenly felt inadequate. Slowly, I reached for my flashlight. When I turned it on, the beam cut through the darkness and landed on the tent wall. The sounds outside stopped immediately. I stayed frozen for what felt like an eternity, listening. Then, just as I was starting to think it might have been an animal passing through, I heard the unmistakable sound of a zipper. My blood ran cold. Someone was unzipping the flap of my tent. Before I could react, the tent collapsed around me. The poles snapped, and the fabric pressed down on my face. I thrashed wildly, trying to fight my way out, but whoever was outside was pulling the tent down with force. I screamed, not caring who or what heard me. Finally, I managed to cut through the fabric with my knife and crawled out, gasping for air. The fire pit provided just enough light to make out the shape of a man standing a few feet away. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes, and holding something in his hand, something long and blunt. I didn't wait to see what he would do. I bolted into the woods, my flashlight bouncing wildly in my hand. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might burst. I didn't know where I was going, just away. Branches slapped my face, and roots threatened to trip me with every step. After what felt like hours, I stopped to catch my breath. I turned off the flashlight, crouching low behind a fallen tree. The forest was silent except for the sound of my own ragged breathing. Then, in the distance, I heard it, the faint crunch of footsteps. He was following me. I waited, trying to control my breathing. When the footsteps grew louder, I knew I had to move. I turned the flashlight on for a split second to get my bearings and saw a rocky slope ahead. I scrambled up it, hoping the uneven terrain would slow him down. At the top, I found a cluster of boulders and squeezed into a narrow gap between them. It was a tight fit, but I felt hidden. I turned off the flashlight again and waited, clutching the knife so tightly my hand ached. Minutes passed, then an hour. I didn't hear anything else, but I didn't dare move. My body was shaking, not from the cold but from adrenaline. I stayed there until the first light of dawn seeped through the trees. When I finally emerged, the forest looked different, less menacing but still eerie in its silence. I made my way back toward the campsite, sticking close to the creek to avoid getting lost. When I reached the site, my stomach dropped. The tent was shredded, my gear was scattered, and my food bag was gone. The fire pit had been kicked over, leaving a mess of ash and soot. Whoever it was, they had been thorough. I didn't waste any time. I grabbed what little I could salvage and started the hike back to my truck. Every sound made me jump. A bird taking flight, a squirrel rustling in the underbrush. Everything felt like a threat. When I finally reached the parking lot, my truck was untouched, but there were fresh boot prints in the dirt nearby. Someone had been there recently. I drove straight to the nearest town and reported what had happened. The local sheriff listened, but I could tell he didn't take me seriously. "Probably some drifter," he said. "You're lucky he didn't do worse." I left feeling frustrated and shaken. The woods, once my sanctuary, now felt like a place of danger. I haven't been camping alone since. I don't know who that man was or what he wanted, but I do know one thing. Some places are wild for a reason, and not all threats in the forest come from nature. I've always loved the outdoors. Growing up in a small town, I spent my childhood exploring the woods behind my house, learning the sounds of the forest, and feeling at home under the canopy of trees. As I got older, camping became my way of reconnecting with that part of myself. It gave me peace, clarity, and a sense of accomplishment. But what happened on my last solo camping trip shattered that comfort and changed how I see the wilderness forever. This particular trip was meant to be a challenge. I'd been planning it for weeks, for days alone in a remote stretch of national forest, far from the usual campsites and hiking trails. The area wasn't completely untouched, but it wasn't heavily trafficked either. It was rugged and wild, and that was exactly what I wanted. I packed carefully, triple-checking my gear: tent, sleeping bag, food, water filter, first aid kit, a sturdy knife, and a headlamp with extra batteries. I even brought a GPS device in case I got turned around. I thought I was prepared for anything. The hike to my planned campsite was about 8 miles from where I parked my car. The trailhead was quiet when I arrived early that morning. I hoisted my pack onto my shoulders, took a deep breath of cool mountain air, and started walking. The first few hours were uneventful. The trail wound through dense pine forest, the ground covered in a thick layer of needles that muffled my footsteps. Birds chirped overhead, and the occasional squirrel darted across the path. As the day wore on and the trail grew steeper, the forest started to thin out. The trees became scraggly and wind-beaten, and the ground turned rocky. By mid-afternoon, I reached the ridge where I planned to set up camp. The view was breathtaking. The forest stretched out below me, a sea of green rolling into the distance. To the west, I could just make out the glint of a distant river. I found a flat spot to pitch my tent, not too close to the edge, but with a clear view of the valley. It was perfect. After setting up camp, I spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the area. I followed a narrow game trail down the ridge to a small stream, where I refilled my water bottles and washed off the sweat and dust from the hike. The sun was starting to dip below the horizon when I made my way back to camp. I cooked a simple dinner on my portable stove, just dehydrated soup and some instant coffee, and sat on a rock to watch the sunset. The sky turned shades of orange and pink, then faded to deep blue as the first stars appeared. I felt completely at peace. The first night passed uneventfully. I slept deeply, lulled by the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. The next day, I spent my time exploring the surrounding forest. I ventured further from camp, marking my path with small cairns of stones to ensure I could find my way back. I found another stream, some interesting rock formations, and even a patch of wildflowers that seemed out of place in the otherwise harsh terrain. By the time I returned to camp, the sun was already low in the sky. I ate another simple meal, watched the stars for a while, and crawled into my tent. It was the second night when things started to feel off that I woke up in the middle of the night to an eerie stillness. The wind had died down, and the usual sounds of the forest, crickets, owls, the occasional rustling in the underbrush were absent. At first, I thought I'd just woken up naturally and that the silence was nothing to worry about. But as I lay there, staring at the ceiling of my tent, I realized something felt wrong. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was a tension in the air that made my skin prickle. I tried to convince myself it was just my imagination. Maybe I wasn't used to the quiet, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But then I heard it, a faint sound, like footsteps crunching on dry leaves. It was distant at first, barely audible, but it was there. My heart started to race. I lay completely still, straining to listen. The sound came again, closer this time. It wasn't steady, like the rhythm of an animal walking. It was irregular, stopping and starting, as if whoever or whatever was out there was trying to move quietly. I reached for my knife, which I'd placed next to me before going to sleep, and gripped it tightly. My mind raced through possibilities. A deer? A bear? Another person? I hadn't seen anyone else on the trail, and this area wasn't popular with hikers. The thought of someone else being out here, sneaking around in the middle of the night, sent a chill down my spine. The footsteps continued, circling my campsite. They never came too close, but they didn't go away either. I lay there for what felt like hours, clutching my knife and listening. Eventually, the sound faded, and the forest was silent again. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, I found no sign of anyone or anything around my camp. No footprints, no disturbed vegetation, nothing. I told myself it must have been an animal, though I couldn't think of any that would behave like that. Still, I couldn't shake the unease that had settled over me. I decided to stay close to camp that day. I spent the morning gathering firewood and the afternoon reading a book I'd brought. By evening, I felt a little more relaxed. I built a fire, hoping the light and warmth would help me feel more secure. It did, at least for a while. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, they were louder, more deliberate. They didn't circle my camp like before. Instead, they approached directly, stopping just beyond the edge of the firelight. I stared into the darkness, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I held my knife in one hand and my flashlight in the other, but I didn't dare turn it on. I didn't want to see what was out there. The footsteps stopped, and for a long time, there was silence. Then, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. A low, guttural breathing. It was slow and heavy, like someone or something was standing just out of sight, watching me. I gripped my knife tighter, my palms slick with sweat. I wanted to run, but where would I go? The forest was vast and dark, and I didn't know what was out there. I don't know how long I sat there, frozen in fear. Eventually, the breathing stopped, and the footsteps retreated into the woods. I didn't sleep at all that night. As soon as the first light of dawn appeared, I packed up my camp and started hiking back to the trailhead. My pack felt heavier than ever, and every sound made me jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see something or someone following me. When I finally reached my car, I felt a wave of relief so intense I nearly collapsed. I threw my pack into the trunk, climbed into the driver's seat, and locked the doors. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. To this day, I don't know what happened out there. I've thought about it endlessly, trying to make sense of it. Maybe it was just an animal, or maybe my mind was playing tricks on me. But deep down, I know that someone or something was out there in the woods with me. And whatever it was, it wanted me to know it was there. That trip changed how I feel about camping. I still love the outdoors, but I'm no longer as comfortable being alone in the wilderness. Now, I always go with friends, and I stick to more populated areas. The forest is beautiful, but it can also be terrifying. And sometimes it's better not to be alone. I've always loved camping. Growing up in Vermont, where nature feels like a constant companion, the outdoors always felt like home to me. There's something about sitting under a canopy of stars, hearing the rustle of trees, and breathing in the cool, pine-scented air that quiets my mind. After moving to Switzerland, I found the Alps equally mesmerizing. It's different, but the call of the wild feels the same. When I planned a solo camping trip in late autumn, I wasn't seeking adventure. I just wanted peace, a break from work and the steady hum of city life. I picked a spot that wasn't too remote, a clearing near a narrow hiking trail I'd taken before, about a 4-hour walk from the nearest village. The map showed a stream nearby, and the area looked secluded but not too isolated. It was mid-November, and I knew the weather could turn quickly, but I packed well, layers of clothing, a good tent, a sleeping bag rated for sub-zero temperatures, and enough food to last 3 days. I was prepared, or so I thought. The hike in was beautiful. The trail wound through dense woods, the kind where sunlight filters through in shifting patterns, and you can almost feel the trees breathing. There was no one else on the trail that day, which suited me fine. Occasionally, I heard the faint crunch of animals moving through the underbrush, but nothing out of the ordinary. By mid-afternoon, I reached the clearing I'd marked on my map. It was perfect, a flat patch of ground surrounded by tall pines, with a shallow stream gurgling a little way off. I set up camp quickly. The tent went up without a hitch, and I gathered enough dry wood for a fire later. As the sun began to dip below the treetops, the air grew colder. I pulled on an extra jacket, lit the fire, and made dinner, a simple meal of instant noodles and tea. The woods were quiet except for the occasional hoot of an owl or the rustle of wind through the branches. The quiet was comforting at first, like a soft blanket wrapping around me. But as the evening wore on, that comfort began to fray. It's hard to pinpoint when it started. Maybe it was the way the wind seemed to pause now and then, leaving a silence so deep it felt heavy, or the subtle shift in the rustling sounds. like something moving closer. I told myself it was just my mind playing tricks. After all, I was alone in the woods at night. It's natural to feel a little on edge. Still, I decided to keep the fire going. Its flickering light felt like a barrier against the darkness pressing in. I sat there, staring into the flames, letting the warmth seep into my bones. Hours passed. The fire crackled, and my nerves settled slightly. I was tired but reluctant to crawl into my tent just yet. The night felt too vast, too alive. Around midnight, I heard it for the first time. A faint, deliberate sound. A crunch, like someone stepping on dry leaves. I froze, straining my ears. The sound came again, this time closer. My heart started to pound. I told myself it had to be an animal, maybe a deer or a fox. But the steps were too slow, too deliberate. Not the quick, skittering movements of a curious critter. I grabbed my flashlight and pointed it in the direction of the sound. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing nothing but trees and shadows. The crunching stopped. I waited, holding my breath, but the forest had gone still again. Finally, I convinced myself it was just my imagination. The fire was still burning strong, and I was probably just overthinking things. I went into my tent, leaving the fire smoldering outside. My sleeping bag was warm, and exhaustion eventually overpowered my unease. I fell into a restless sleep. I woke up abruptly in the early hours of the morning. It was still dark outside, but something had jolted me awake. For a moment, I lay there, disoriented, trying to figure out what had disturbed me. Then I heard it again, a soft, scraping sound, like something brushing against the nylon of my tent. I froze, every muscle tensed. The sound moved around the tent, slow and deliberate. My mind raced through possibilities. An animal? But it didn't sound like claws or a snout sniffing around. The movement was too smooth, too deliberate. I reached for my flashlight and knife, my hands trembling. Flicking on the light, I aimed it at the tent walls, hoping to scare off whatever was outside. The sound stopped instantly. The silence was deafening. I stayed like that for what felt like hours, flashlight in hand, heart pounding. Eventually, the first light of dawn crept through the trees, and the familiar sounds of the forest waking up began to fill the air. The fear that had gripped me all night started to loosen its hold. When I finally stepped out of the tent, the clearing looked untouched. No signs of anything unusual. I told myself it must have been an animal, that I'd overreacted. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I decided to cut my trip short. Packing up quickly, I headed back to the trail. The hike out felt different. The woods, so welcoming the day before, now seemed oppressive. Every crack of a branch, every rustle of leaves made my pulse quicken. I couldn't shake the sensation of eyes on me, though I saw no one. About halfway back to the village, I found something that made my blood run cold. In the middle of the trail was a small pile of rocks, stacked neatly, deliberately. It hadn't been there on my way in. I was sure of it. My mind raced. Was it a coincidence? Had someone else passed through here? I didn't stop to think about it for long. Quickening my pace, I pushed forward, not stopping until I reached the village. The relief I felt stepping onto the paved road was almost overwhelming. Even now, weeks later, I can't explain what happened that night. Maybe it was just my imagination, amplified by the isolation and the dark. Or maybe someone or something was out there in the woods with me. All I know is that I haven't been camping alone since. I didn't expect the hike to be easy, but I also didn't expect it to test every ounce of my patience and endurance. It was early October, and I had set out on a solo camping trip in a remote area of the Adirondacks. I'd spent months planning this, poring over maps, checking gear, and making sure I was physically prepared. I'd done solo trips before, but something about this one felt different. Maybe it was the isolation. The area I chose wasn't a popular spot, and I liked it that way. No crowded trails, no sounds of other people. Just me and nature. The drive out took almost 5 hours. By the time I parked my car at the trailhead, the afternoon sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows over the dense forest. The trail was narrow, barely marked, and wound through a maze of tall pines and thick undergrowth. My destination was a clearing about 7 miles in, where I planned to set up camp near a small lake. It was the kind of spot you'd see on a postcard, calm water reflecting the surrounding trees, with a view of distant peaks. The first few miles were uneventful. The air was crisp, and the scent of pine was heavy in the cool breeze. I could hear the occasional rustle of leaves as squirrels darted through the underbrush, and once, I spotted a deer standing motionless in the distance, its ears twitching. I kept a steady pace, stopping only briefly to adjust my pack or sip water. The trail was more rugged than I anticipated, with steep inclines and patches of loose rocks, but I felt strong and determined. As the sun dipped lower, the forest grew darker. I'd brought a headlamp, but I didn't want to use it yet. There was something about walking in the fading light that felt more immersive, more connected to the environment. By the time I reached the clearing, the sky was a deep orange, fading into indigo. The lake was just as beautiful as I imagined. The water was still, except for the occasional ripple from a fish breaking the surface. The surrounding trees were a mix of green and fiery autumn colors, their reflections shimmering in the fading light. I wasted no time setting up camp. My tent was a compact one-person model, lightweight and easy to pitch. Once it was up, I gathered some wood for a small fire. The forest floor was littered with dry twigs and branches, so it didn't take long. By the time I had a fire going, the sky was completely dark, and the temperature had dropped significantly. I cooked a simple meal, a freeze-dried pasta dish, and ate it slowly, savoring the warmth. The fire crackled softly, and the glow of the flames created a comforting bubble of light in the otherwise pitch-black night. After cleaning up and securing my food in a bare canister away from the tent, I settled in for the night. I crawled into my sleeping bag, exhausted but content. The silence was absolute, broken only by the occasional hoot of an owl or the distant howl of a coyote. I drifted off to sleep quickly, lulled by the sounds of the wilderness. I woke up abruptly in the middle of the night. At first, I wasn't sure why. My heart was pounding, and I lay still, straining to hear. The fire had burned down to embers, and the tent was dark except for the faint moonlight filtering through the fabric. Then I heard it, a faint rustling sound, like something moving through the underbrush. It wasn't close, but it wasn't far either. I stayed completely still, listening. It could have been an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer, but something about the sound unsettled me. It was too deliberate, too heavy. Whatever it was, it didn't seem to be in a hurry. The rustling would stop for a few moments, then start again, closer this time. I reached for my flashlight, my hand trembling slightly. When I turned it on, the beam of light illuminated the inside of the tent, casting shadows that danced with every movement. I didn't unzip the tent. Instead, I listened, hoping the sound would move away, but it didn't. It grew closer until it was just outside my tent. My breathing was shallow, my pulse hammering in my ears. Then silence. Whatever was out there had stopped moving. I gripped the flashlight tightly, debating whether to call out or make a noise to scare it off. Before I could decide, I heard a new sound, a soft scraping, like something being dragged across the ground. It was faint but distinct, and it sent a chill down my spine. Gathering my courage, I unzipped the tent just enough to peek outside. The firelight had all but disappeared, leaving only the dim glow of the moon. The forest was a maze of shadows, and at first, I saw nothing unusual. Then, About 20 feet away, I spotted movement. A dark figure was crouched low to the ground, partially obscured by the trees. It was too far to make out details, but it was definitely human. My first thought was to call out, but something stopped me. The figure wasn't moving like someone lost or looking for help. They were methodical, deliberate. They appeared to be dragging something. A long, heavy object that I couldn't identify in the low light. I froze, unsure of what to do. The figure didn't seem to notice me. They moved slowly, disappearing into the trees. I sat there for what felt like hours, my mind racing. Who could be out here in the middle of nowhere in the dead of night? And what were they dragging? I considered packing up and leaving, but the thought of walking through the dark forest with that person, or whoever else might be out there, was terrifying. Instead, I stayed in the tent, clutching my flashlight and bear spray, and waited for dawn. When the first light of morning crept through the trees, I finally felt a sense of relief. I stepped out of the tent, scanning the area carefully. There was no sign of the figure or whatever they had been dragging. The forest was calm, almost eerily so. I decided to pack up and head back to the trailhead as quickly as possible. As I dismantled the tent, I noticed something odd. About 10 feet from my campsite, the ground was disturbed. The dirt was scuffed, and there were drag marks leading into the woods, the same direction the figure had gone. My stomach churned, and I felt an overwhelming urge to leave. The hike back was grueling. Every sound made me jump, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I forced myself to keep moving, resisting the urge to run. When I finally reached the trailhead and saw my car, I almost cried with relief. I threw my gear in the trunk and sped away, not looking back. Later, when I told a friend about the trip, they suggested it might have been a poacher or someone burying illegal traps. Maybe that was true, but I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever I saw wasn't just someone minding their own business. To this day, I don't know who or what was out there, and I'm not sure I want to. That trip was my last solo hike. Something about the experience changed the way I see the wilderness. It's beautiful, yes, but it's also vast and indifferent. You never really know who or what you might encounter out there. I've always loved camping. Growing up in Vermont, nature was a constant companion, and weekends often meant hikes in the forest or nights spent under a canopy of stars. When I moved to Switzerland, I discovered that the mountains here offered a beauty that was just as captivating. One weekend in late September, I decided to camp solo near a less-traveled trail deep in the Jura Mountains. It was the off-season for most hikers, and I wanted solitude. The drive to the trailhead took me through winding roads flanked by dense forests and occasional clearings with postcard-perfect views of the valley below. I parked at a small gravel lot where only one other car sat, a dusty station wagon that looked like it hadn't moved in days. I took a moment to adjust my pack, double-checking the essentials: tent, sleeping bag, food, water, and a first aid kit. The weather forecast was clear, with temperatures dipping just below freezing at night. The trail itself was narrow and overgrown in some spots, proof that this wasn't a popular route. The first couple of hours passed uneventfully. The forest was alive with the sound of birds and the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. As I climbed higher, the trees thinned, revealing glimpses of jagged cliffs and rolling hills in the distance. By late afternoon, I reached a small plateau with a perfect view of the surrounding mountains. The spot was flat, sheltered by a cluster of pines, and offered just enough space for my tent. I set up camp quickly, taking care to position the tent away from a slight dip in the ground where rain might pool, even though the sky was clear. After unpacking, I boiled water for a simple meal of instant noodles and tea. The air grew colder as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of orange and purple. Wrapped in my jacket, I sat outside the tent, enjoying the silence and the occasional crackle of branches in the fire I'd built. By the time darkness fully enveloped the campsite, the fire was dying down. I crawled into my tent, zipping myself snugly into my sleeping bag. The forest at night was a symphony of sounds: distant owl calls, the rustle of nocturnal creatures, and the whisper of wind through the trees. It was soothing, and I drifted off quickly. I woke abruptly. My phone's screen read 2:17 a.m. It wasn't unusual for me to wake up during the night while camping, but something felt off. The forest was unnaturally quiet. Gone were the soothing night sounds, replaced by a stillness that felt oppressive. I lay there, straining to hear anything. A branch snapping, a gust of wind, but there was nothing. Then I heard it, a faint, rhythmic crunching, like footsteps on dry leaves. The sound came from somewhere to my left, near the edge of the campsite. My heart pounded as I held my breath, listening. The steps were deliberate, moving closer and then pausing, as if whoever or whatever was out there was surveying the area. I stayed still, hoping whoever it was would pass by without noticing the tent. My mind raced with possibilities. Could be another hiker, maybe someone who had gotten lost and stumbled upon my camp. But the deliberate pauses between the footsteps felt calculated, almost predatory. The sound stopped altogether, and the silence stretched on. I debated whether to unzip the tent and look, but fear kept me frozen. Minutes passed, then a full hour, and I heard nothing else. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and I drifted back into a fitful sleep. Morning brought a sense of relief. Sunlight filtered through the trees, and the familiar sounds of the forest returned. I stepped outside, scanning the area. At first glance, everything seemed normal, but then I noticed faint footprints in the dirt, circling the tent. They were too large to be from an animal, and the way they meandered around the campsite sent a chill down my spine. I decided to pack up and head back to the car. The feeling of unease lingered, but I convinced myself it was probably just another camper who had wandered too close and left without realizing I was there. The hike back was uneventful, but when I reached the trailhead, I stopped in my tracks. The station wagon was gone, replaced by a different car, a dark SUV with tinted windows. It wasn't unusual for hikers to come and go, but something about this vehicle felt out of place. It was spotless, as if it had been washed recently, and the windows were so dark I couldn't see inside. Shrugging off the feeling, I loaded my gear into my car and started the drive home. The narrow roads wound through the forest, and the bright morning sunlight made everything feel less ominous. About 20 minutes into the drive, I noticed something in my rearview mirror. The dark SUV was following me. At first, I thought it might be a coincidence, but as the kilometers ticked by, it stayed behind me, keeping a steady distance. I decided to test my theory. At the next junction, I turned onto a smaller road that led to a nearby village. The SUV followed. My pulse quickened. I wasn't familiar with the area, but I knew I needed to find a safe place to stop. The road eventually led to a small gas station. I pulled in, parking near the entrance. The SUV slowed as it approached but didn't stop. Instead, it continued down the road and disappeared around a bend. I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding and went inside the station to grab a coffee. When I returned to my car, a piece of paper was tucked under the windshield wiper. I unfolded it, my hands trembling. The note was scrawled in jagged handwriting. Next time, don't camp alone. I looked around, but the gas station was empty except for the clerk inside. There was no sign of the SUV or anyone else nearby. Heart pounding, I got into my car and drove straight home, glancing nervously at my mirrors the entire way. That was the last time I camped alone. Even now, months later, the memory of that night lingers. I don't know who was out there or what their intentions were, but the warning was clear. Sometimes, solitude in the wilderness isn't worth the risk. I've always loved the wilderness. Growing up, my father would take me camping every summer, teaching me how to pitch a tent, start a fire, and read the land. He used to say, "Respect nature, and it will respect you." Over the years, I learned how to navigate trails, spot signs of wildlife, and handle myself in the woods. These skills became second nature, and I grew confident in my ability to handle the great outdoors. But no amount of experience could have prepared me for what happened on my solo camping trip last year. It was late September, just as the leaves were starting to change. I had taken a week off from work to escape the monotony of my 9 to 5. I wanted to go somewhere remote, somewhere I wouldn't see another soul for days. After some research, I settled on a national forest about a 6-hour drive from my home. The trail I chose was lightly trafficked and led to a secluded lake surrounded by dense woods. It was perfect. I packed my gear meticulously: tent, sleeping bag, food, water filter, knife, first aid kit. Everything was accounted for. I even brought a small emergency beacon just in case. My friends teased me for being overly cautious, but I didn't care. It was better to be prepared than to regret it later. The drive to the trailhead was uneventful, though the last hour was spent on a bumpy dirt road that twisted through thick forest. When I finally arrived, there was only one other car parked at the trailhead, a dusty sedan with an out-of-state license plate. I felt a small pang of relief. I liked the idea of being alone, but knowing someone else was out here made me feel a little safer. I shouldered my pack and set off down the trail. The air was crisp, and the scent of pine was heavy in the air. The forest was alive with the sounds of rustling leaves and distant bird calls. The first few miles were peaceful, almost meditative. I felt the stress of work and city life melt away with each step. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, I reached the lake. It was breathtaking. The water was so still it looked like glass, reflecting the orange and pink hues of the sky. I found a small clearing near the shore and set up my tent. After gathering some firewood, I built a small fire and cooked a simple meal of rice and canned chicken. As I ate, I watched the stars emerge, one by one, until the sky was a sea of glittering lights. That first night was uneventful. I fell asleep to the sound of gentle waves lapping against the shore. When I woke up, the sun was just beginning to rise, casting a golden glow over the lake. I spent the morning exploring the area, fishing, and taking photos. It was exactly the escape I had hoped for. Things started to feel off on the second night. It began with the feeling of being watched. I had just finished dinner and was sitting by the fire, staring into the flames. The forest around me was dark, the kind of dark that swallows everything beyond the reach of the firelight. I couldn't shake the sensation that someone, or something, was out there, just beyond the edge of the light, watching me. I told myself it was nothing. Being alone in the woods can play tricks on your mind. Every rustle of leaves, every snap of a twig, becomes amplified, feeding your imagination. I tried to ignore it and focus on the fire, but the feeling wouldn't go away. When I finally crawled into my tent, I couldn't relax. My ears were tuned to every sound outside. The occasional breeze rustling the trees, the distant hoot of an owl. These were normal. But then I heard something else. A faint crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves. It was slow and deliberate, not the erratic scurrying of an animal. I held my breath, straining to listen. The footsteps stopped, and there was silence. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe a raccoon, but deep down I didn't believe it. My heart was pounding as I gripped the knife I kept by my sleeping bag. Eventually, exhaustion overtook me, and I fell into a restless sleep. The next morning, I found tracks near my campsite. They weren't animal tracks, they were boot prints. They led from the woods to the edge of my campsite and then back into the trees. My stomach churned as I stared at them. Someone had been here watching me while I slept. I debated packing up and leaving, but the stubborn part of me didn't want to let fear ruin my trip. I decided to stay, but I couldn't shake the unease that settled over me like a heavy blanket. That day, I stayed close to camp. I didn't wander far, keeping my knife and bear spray within arm's reach at all times. I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the trees for any sign of movement. The forest, once peaceful and inviting, now felt oppressive. Every shadow seemed to hide a potential threat. As night fell, my anxiety grew. I built a larger fire than usual, hoping the light would deter anyone or anything from coming too close. I sat with my back to the lake, where I could see the entire campsite and the surrounding woods. My knife was in my lap, and the bear spray was clipped to my belt. The hours dragged by. The fire crackled, and the forest was eerily quiet. I was just starting to think I might be overreacting when I heard it again. The unmistakable sound of footsteps. They were slow and deliberate, coming from the direction of the trail. I froze, gripping my knife tightly. The footsteps stopped just outside the circle of firelight. I couldn't see anything beyond the flickering glow of the flames, but I could feel someone, or something, standing there, watching me. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. There was no response. I stood up, trying to appear confident, even though my legs felt like jelly. "I'm armed," I said, hoping to scare them off. Still, there was no response. Then, just as suddenly as the footsteps had started, they retreated. The sound of crunching leaves grew fainter and fainter until it disappeared altogether. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, staring into the darkness, waiting for something to happen. But nothing did. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed by the fire, knife in hand, jumping at every sound. When the first light of dawn broke through the trees, I started packing my gear. I didn't care that I had planned to stay another night. I just wanted to get out of there. As I was taking down my tent, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the other side of the clearing, where the woods began, there was a small pile of rocks stacked neatly on top of each other. It hadn't been there the day before. Someone had placed it there during the night. I didn't waste any more time. I shouldered my pack and started down the trail, moving as quickly as I could without running. My heart was pounding, and I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see someone following me. The forest felt alive, like it was closing in around me. The hike back to the trailhead felt endless. Every noise made me jump. Every shadow looked like a person. When I finally saw my car, relief washed over me like a tidal wave. I practically threw my gear into the trunk and jumped into the driver's seat, locking the doors behind me. As I started the engine and pulled onto the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw someone standing at the edge of the trees, watching me. But when I looked again, they were gone. I don't know who or what was out there that night. Maybe it was just a prankster trying to scare me. Maybe it was something more sinister. All I know is that I've never felt fear like that before, and I've never gone camping alone since. The wilderness is beautiful, but it's also unpredictable. You can prepare for almost anything, but you can't prepare for the unknown. That trip reminded me of something my father used to say: respect nature, but never forget that it doesn't owe you safety. I don't think he was just talking about the weather or wild animals. Sometimes the most dangerous thing in the woods isn't nature, it's other people.